All right, welcome back. Last time we talked about the Rothschilds, a family that built the most sophisticated private financial network in 19th century Europe, got turned into a conspiracy theory, and whose real story is actually far more interesting than the myth. Today we're going to a different family, an older family, a family that, in many ways, invented the template the Rothschilds later used. We're going to Florence, Italy, the 1400s, and we're going to talk about the Medici. Now, here's the thing about the Medici that most people miss. Everyone knows the name. Everyone has a vague sense that they were powerful, that they funded the Renaissance, that they produced popes and queens. But the actual mechanics of how they built that power, how a family of wool traders turned into the most influential dynasty in Europe, that story is almost never told clearly. So that's what we're doing today. Because the Medici story is not just a history lesson. It's a masterclass in how power actually gets constructed. And once you understand what they actually did, you start seeing echoes of it everywhere. In Silicon Valley, in modern banking, in the way political influence operates today. Let's go back to the beginning. Florence in the early 1300s is one of the most extraordinary cities on earth. It's not large by modern standards, maybe 90,000 people at its peak before the plague, but it punches far above its weight economically. Florence is the financial capital of Europe. Florentine bankers are everywhere, in London, in Paris, in the courts of kings and popes. They've invented instruments of finance, letters of credit, double-entry bookkeeping that the rest of Europe is still struggling to understand. And at the center of this financial world is the wool trade. Florence makes cloth, extraordinarily fine cloth, and sells it across the continent. The great Florentine families built their fortunes on wool. The Medici started there. They were not aristocrats. They had no ancient lineage, no inherited title. They were merchants, tradesmen who'd worked their way up through the guild system that governed Florentine commerce. By the late 1300s, they were comfortable, but not dominant. There were wealthier families in Florence. There were more powerful families in Florence. Then came Giovanni di Bici de' Medici. Giovanni was born around 1360, and Giovanni did something that changed everything. He moved the family out of wool and into banking. Not just banking, church banking. Giovanni cultivated a relationship with the papacy that gave the Medici Bank a position no other Florentine bank had. They became the primary bankers to the Catholic Church, handling the collection of papal revenues from across Europe, transferring funds between the Holy See and its various operations, managing the finances of an institution that was, in the early 1400s, the largest single economic entity in the Western world. Think about what that meant. The Catholic Church collected fees and tithes from every corner of Christian Europe. Money flowed in from England, from Germany, from France, from Spain, from Hungary, from Poland, and all of it had to be converted from local currencies, transferred across borders, and made available in Rome. Banks that handled this got a cut of every transaction. They also got something even more valuable: information. They knew which regions were economically prospering. They knew which kingdoms were reliable and which were struggling. They knew, before almost anyone, where the economic center of gravity of Europe was shifting. Giovanni kept his head down. This is important. He was famously cautious, famously quiet. He avoided Florentine politics as much as possible. He paid his taxes. He didn't make enemies. He just built the bank. When he died in 1429, he left his son Cosimo something extraordinary: the most profitable bank in Europe, a network of branches across the continent, and a reputation for reliability and discretion that was worth more than any contract. Cosimo de' Medici is the one who changes everything. If Giovanni built the engine, Cosimo turned it into a dynasty. Cosimo was brilliant in a specific way. He understood something that very few people in 15th century Florence understood: that in a republic, which Florence technically was, raw wealth alone wasn't enough. You needed the appearance of serving the public good. You needed the population on your side. You needed, if you were going to run things from behind the scenes, to be seen as just a citizen, just a merchant, not a lord. Florence had powerful families who had made the mistake of reaching too obviously for formal power. They got expelled, or assassinated, or both. Cosimo watched this and learned. He never took a title. He never declared himself ruler of Florence. He held civic offices, as every prominent Florentine was expected to do, but he never accumulated the kind of formal political authority that would make him a target. What he did instead was become indispensable. Need money for a war? The Medici bank will lend it. Need to negotiate with the Pope? Cosimo has relationships. Need a diplomatic favor from Venice? Cosimo knows the right people. Need someone to mediate a dispute between two powerful Florentine families? Cosimo is available. Cosimo is always available. He constructed a web of obligations that spread across every level of Florentine society. Poorer families received loans, patronage, jobs. Middle-class merchants received access to the bank's networks and connections. Powerful families received the social capital of being associated with the Medici name. In 1433, the rival Albizzi family managed to have Cosimo arrested and exiled from Florence. They thought they'd won. They hadn't. Within a year, Cosimo's friends and clients in the government, the people who owed him, who depended on him, had maneuvered the political situation so completely that the Albizzi were expelled instead. Cosimo returned to Florence in triumph. He never had to fire a weapon. He never had to issue an order. He just waited, and the network he'd built did the work for him. For the next 30 years, Cosimo ran Florence, not as a prince, not as a dictator, as what the Florentines called the Pater Patriae, the father of the fatherland, a private citizen who just happened to be present at every important decision. This is the model. This is the thing that gets copied across centuries. Power through indispensability. Influence through relationships rather than formal authority. The network as the real source of strength, not the title. Now, Cosimo also did something that Giovanni never did. He invested in culture. And I don't mean this as a footnote. This was strategic genius of the highest order. Florence in the mid-1400s was in the middle of something extraordinary, what we now call the Renaissance, the rediscovery of classical antiquity, the explosion of art and literature and philosophy that would transform European civilization. Cosimo understood that culture was soft power. He founded libraries, he patronized scholars, he brought Greek manuscripts to Florence from the dying Byzantine Empire. He established the Platonic Academy, a salon of philosophers and thinkers that met regularly at his villa and made Florence the intellectual center of Europe. He commissioned buildings, churches, palaces. The great dome of Florence's cathedral was completed under his influence. And then, art. Donatello, Fra Angelico, Filippo Brunelleschi. When you walk through the great museums of the world and see the art of the Florentine Renaissance, when you stand in front of works that changed how human beings represent the world, a significant portion of that art exists because Cosimo de' Medici decided that patronage was a form of politics. His grandson Lorenzo would take this understanding to its ultimate conclusion. Lorenzo de' Medici is the one history calls Lorenzo the Magnificent. And he earned it. Lorenzo took power in 1469 at the age of just 20. He was not, by temperament, a banker. The financial management of the Medici bank would actually deteriorate significantly under his watch. He was too distracted by everything else to give it proper attention. But as a political and cultural operator, he was extraordinary. Lorenzo understood that the Medici position rested on a foundation that could crack. Florence was full of rival families, rival ambitions, rival interests. The papacy had political needs that didn't always align with Florentine interests. And lurking in every Florentine palazzo was the knowledge that what the Medici had accumulated, they had accumulated without any formal right to hold it. He worked the diplomatic situation with tireless energy. He maintained personal relationships with rulers across Italy, the Sforza in Milan, the Este in Ferrara, the Aragonese in Naples, and positioned Florence as an indispensable force for stability on the Italian peninsula. He supported Florentine arts not just as patronage, but as state building. The great artists of Florence, Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci in his early career, later Michelangelo, were not just producing beautiful objects. They were producing the image of a civilization. When foreign dignitaries came to Florence, what they saw was a city that seemed to have reached a higher plane of human achievement. That impression translated into political respect. And then, in April of 1478, came the Pazzi conspiracy, and Lorenzo was nearly killed. The Pazzi were a rival banking family with deep papal connections. Pope Sixtus IV had reasons of his own to want Medici influence diminished. The Medici had recently blocked some of his territorial ambitions. The conspiracy brought them together. The plan was simple and brutal: assassinate Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano during High Mass at the Florence Cathedral. In the sacred space, in front of the entire Florentine elite, strike simultaneously, and then use the chaos to seize the government. On April 26, 1478, the assassin struck. Giuliano was killed. stabbed 19 times. Lorenzo was wounded, a sword cut to the neck, but he escaped. He was pulled into the sacristy by his companions while the conspirators tried to finish the job. They failed. And what happened next told you everything about the nature of Medici power. The Florentine population, ordinary citizens, the people who'd received patronage, whose neighborhoods had been improved, who'd worked in industries the Medici supported, rose up in their defense. The conspirators and their allies were hunted down. Many were killed immediately. Others were tried and executed. The Pazzi family was destroyed, their name was banned in Florence, their coat of arms removed from public buildings. The Pope had backed the conspiracy. Lorenzo's response was to use his diplomatic network across Italy to isolate Rome, to work the other Italian powers against the papacy, and eventually to negotiate a settlement on his terms. He emerged from the conspiracy stronger than he'd entered it. Because the conspiracy had proved something that couldn't otherwise be proved, the Medici weren't just bankers who'd bought loyalty. They had actual support. People would fight for them. Lorenzo died in 1492. He was only 43 years old. His health had been deteriorating for years. He suffered from gout that grew increasingly severe. The timing was catastrophic. Just 2 years after his death, the French King Charles VIII invaded Italy. Florence fell into chaos, and his son Piero made such disastrous decisions in response that the Medici were expelled from Florence entirely. The dynasty that had seemed so secure, so deeply embedded in Florentine life that it seemed inseparable from it, was gone within 24 months of Lorenzo's death. It would take 18 years for the Medici to return. But when they did, they returned with something completely new. Okay, that's the first half. Let's take a breath and talk about where we are. We've covered the rise, from Giovanni's quiet genius in church banking to Cosimo's reinvention of political power as a private network, to Lorenzo's transformation of culture into statecraft. But the second half of the Medici story is in some ways more remarkable, because what we're going to see now is how the family survived catastrophe, multiple catastrophes, and transformed itself. From the leading family of one Italian city into something genuinely unprecedented. A dynasty that placed its members on the papal throne and the royal thrones of Europe. And then, after all of that, how the whole thing ended. Let's pick it up where we left off. 1494. The Medici have been expelled from Florence. Piero, Lorenzo's eldest son, called the Unfortunate by history, a label he earned, handed over Florentine fortresses to the French king without a fight. Florence was humiliated. The population was furious. The Medici were out. For the next few years, Florence went through convulsions. There was Savonarola, the firebrand Dominican friar who took over the city in the power vacuum, preached that Florence's sins had brought divine punishment, and organized the famous Bonfire of the Vanities in which artworks, mirrors, fine clothes, books considered immoral were burned in the public square. Savonarola's rule lasted 4 years before the Florentines had enough of his extremism, and he himself was burned at the stake in 1498. The city swung between different factions for years after. And through all of this, the Medici were in exile, plotting, corresponding, waiting. The return came in 1512, engineered not by the Medici themselves, but by papal politics. Pope Julius II, one of the great warrior popes, the man who commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling, organized a holy league against the French presence in Italy. Spanish forces that had expelled the French from Naples now marched north. Florence, which had tried to stay neutral, found itself on the wrong side. Spanish troops seized the city, and the price of their departure was the restoration of the Medici. Giuliano de' Medici, Lorenzo's son, not the one killed in the conspiracy, entered Florence and the family was back. But here's what's crucial. The family that returned was different from the family that left. The generation that came back understood that Florence alone was not enough. That a single Italian city, however wealthy, was too fragile a base of power. They needed something more durable. They needed Rome. In 1513, something happened that would have been almost unimaginable to Meyer Amschel Rothschild, that Frankfurt ghetto merchant we talked about last week, but that might have seemed the natural culmination of everything the Medici had built. Giovanni de' Medici, Lorenzo's second son, was elected pope. He took the name Leo X, a Medici pope. Think about what this meant. The Catholic Church in 1513 was not just a religious institution. It was a political power that touched every corner of Christian Europe. It had diplomatic relations with every monarchy. It controlled an independent state in central Italy. It commanded loyalty from hundreds of millions of people. And now, its leader was the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent. Leo X's pontificate was famous for extravagance. He reportedly said upon his election, "God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it," and for a catastrophic miscalculation. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg, and Leo treated it as a minor theological dispute to be managed rather than the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. History did not judge that assessment kindly, but the Medici didn't stop with Leo X. In 1523, another Medici became Pope. Giulio de' Medici, Lorenzo's nephew, illegitimate technically, which required a papal dispensation even to become a cardinal, became Clement VII. Two Medici popes within a decade. Clement VII's pontificate included one of the most traumatic events in Renaissance history, the sack of Rome in 1527. When the forces of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, technically Catholic forces, which made it all the more shocking, ran completely out of control and pillaged the city for months. Clement fled dressed as a servant, hiding from imperial troops who were looking for hostages to ransom. But even this catastrophe, as total as it seemed in the moment, didn't end the family. Because while the popes were managing Rome, another branch of the family was consolidating its hold on Florence itself. And now, consolidating it more formally than the previous generation had ever dared. In 1532, Alessandro de' Medici became the first Duke of Florence. Not a behind-the-scenes power broker, not a citizen who just happened to be indispensable. A duke. With a title. With formal hereditary authority. The long Medici game of "we're just merchants" was over. They were now openly what they had always effectively been. Rulers. And then they aimed higher. The most astonishing chapter of Medici dynastic ambition played out not in Italy but in France. In 1533, Catherine de' Medici, the great-granddaughter of Lorenzo the Magnificent, married Henry, Duke of Orleans, the second son of the French king. She was 14 years old. He was also 14. The match was arranged by Pope Clement VII, the Medici Pope, as part of a diplomatic settlement with the French crown. No one expected Catherine to amount to very much. She was a useful diplomatic piece, bringing Medici money and papal connections to a French royal marriage. Henry didn't particularly like her. The French court was openly contemptuous, the foreign banker's daughter who spoke French with an Italian accent. 10 years into the marriage, she had produced no children. The whispers were that Henry would find a way to have the marriage annulled. And then she started having children. 10 of them. Henry became king in 1547. Catherine became Queen of France. And then, in 1559, Henry was killed in a jousting accident. Catherine was 40 years old, a widow with a 15-year-old son on the throne of France. For the next 30 years, Catherine de' Medici was the most powerful woman in Europe. 3 of her sons reigned as kings of France. She served as regent, as royal advisor, as the one constant force in a French court torn apart by religious civil war between Catholics and Protestant Huguenots. She made terrible decisions. She made brilliant decisions. She navigated a country on the edge of collapse through decades of crisis. The Saint. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, the killing of thousands of Huguenots on a single night in 1572, remains one of the most controversial acts of her reign. Its precise causes still debated by historians. But she kept the French monarchy alive. In a century when it easily could have collapsed, France held together. A Florentine banker's descendant, sitting in Paris, holding the most powerful kingdom in Europe. And then there was another Medici who would be Queen of France, Marie de' Medici, who married Henri IV in 1600. 2 Medici queens of France. 2 Medici popes. The Grand Duchy of Tuscany, which emerged from the older Duchy of Florence, would be ruled by Medici descendants for another 200 years. The family that started in a wool workshop in Florence had placed its members on more thrones and in more positions of supreme power than virtually any dynasty in European history. How? Not through conquest, not through ancient lineage, not through the accident of being born into a royal house, through banking, through relationships, through the systematic construction of obligations and dependencies and cultural prestige over generations. But now we need to talk about what brought it all down. Because the Medici story is also a story about entropy, about how the very success that makes a dynasty seems invincible also plants the seeds of its decline. The Grand Dukes of Tuscany, who ruled Florence in the final Medici generations, had wealth and titles, but none of the political genius of their ancestors. The later Medici were known for eccentricity, poor health, and a failure to produce heirs. The last of the male Medici line died in 1737. His name was Gian Gaston, and his reign was a study in motivated decadence. He spent much of it drunk in bed, his court was notorious for disorder, and he died leaving no heir. His sister, Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici, was the last of the family. She'd outlived her husband and her brother. She was alone. Anna Maria Luisa made the decision that arguably constitutes the greatest act of cultural stewardship in European history. She could have taken the Medici collections, the paintings, the sculptures, the manuscripts, the jewels, the entire accumulated treasure of 3 centuries of patronage to Vienna, where her Habsburg heirs would scatter it across the empire. She refused. She signed the family pact with the new rulers of Tuscany. Everything stays in Florence. The collections must remain accessible to the public. The art and the city cannot be separated. Because of Anna Maria Luisa, the Uffizi Gallery exists as it does today. The Bargello, the Medici chapels, the extraordinary concentration of Renaissance art in Florence that draws millions of visitors every year, all of that exists because the last Medici chose to give it away rather than preserve it for her heirs. There's a lesson in that ending. The Medici began by understanding that culture was power, that to invest in art and scholarship was not charity but strategy. And at the very end, stripped of every other form of power, one of them took that original insight to its ultimate conclusion: the art was more important than the family. What we take from the Medici. The obvious thing to say is, they were patrons of the Renaissance. They funded the artists and thinkers who transformed Western civilization. That's true, but I think there's a more precise lesson. The Medici built power through 3 mechanisms that don't usually get discussed together, but that are completely interrelated. First, financial centrality. By becoming the banker to the most important institution in their world, the Catholic Church, they positioned themselves at the intersection of money flows that shaped everything. Information, relationships, and leverage all flowed naturally from that position. Second, obligatory networks. Cosimo de' Medici didn't accumulate power through force. He accumulated it through obligation. Every favor given was a future claim held. Every loan made was a relationship created. The network of people who owed the Medici, financially, politically, socially, was the real source of power. The bank was just the engine. Third, cultural legitimacy. The Medici understood earlier than almost anyone that, in a world where formal authority is contested, the power to define what a civilization values is decisive. They didn't just commission art. They positioned themselves as the stewards of human excellence. And that gave them a kind of legitimacy that no political opponent could simply cancel. These 3 mechanisms, financial centrality, obligatory networks, cultural legitimacy, are not specific to 15th century Florence. They are the operating principles of every major dynastic power in history. You can see them in the Rothschilds, who we discussed last week. You can see them in the great American dynasties, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, who also understood that philanthropy was a form of legitimacy building. You can see them in a radically transformed form in the way that modern tech platforms build power. Financial centrality, networks of obligation, cultural legitimacy. That's the Medici formula. It worked for 300 years. And here is the uncomfortable question to sit with. In a world where art funding has been replaced by venture capital, where obligatory networks are maintained through social media and conference circuits, and where cultural legitimacy is something you can purchase with a foundation and a donation to the right museum, are we watching a new version of the same formula playing out? The Medici didn't control Florence through force. They controlled it by making themselves impossible to remove without destroying something everyone valued. Who does that describe today? That is the story of the Medici.